Hello, today we have Glen Bowman, a professor of history at Elizabeth City State University, and he will provide a detailed insight on the early history of what became known as P.W. Moore Junior Senior High School. Let's welcome Dr. Glen Bowman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome. I know this is Potato Festival weekend, and I thank you for being here. I know the parking arrangement isn't ideal. I was confused about getting here myself, so thank you for being here. I know some of you who are listening are at home, relaxing, listening to this on our Zoom account, and I thank you for being there too. This is an important part of history in many regards. Even though those who are local see P.W. Moore as an elementary school that serves the community, historically, the name P.W. Moore was not associated with elementary education. It was associated first with higher education at what is now ECSU, and also with secondary education with P.W. Moore Junior Senior High School. So the talk today is entitled Step by Step on the Road to Excellence, P.W. Moore Junior Senior High School from its beginnings until 1934. And a couple of things I want to do is I'm going to hold on here. Wait a minute. Okay, I'm gonna have to do it this way. Okay, great. Got my arrows crossed here. The fact is that those who have been born and raised here recognize what I'm going to share, and that is that P.W. Moore was known primarily for about 40, close to 40 years as also a junior senior high school. It ended its history as a high school in 1969 once the new desegregated high school opened up, and that is Northeastern High School. Northeastern High School is still with us today. And the reality is that before the opening of Northeastern High School, those who were not white, African Americans they wanted a high school education, had to go for most of those 46 years of its history, go to P.W. Moore Junior Senior High School. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just three main points here. I'm going to talk about the pre-1923 beginnings, because 1923 was the year during which the school officially opened up. We'll talk about kind of what happened before then, because it didn't just pop up out of the ground like a flower, like a bulb in springtime, but it had some history that needs to be understood. They'll also talk about how the school was actually founded. It was established, and in this way, it was unique. I can't think of any other high school in North Carolina that was established the way that this school was established. And this story is a fascinating story, and you're gonna be happy that you're here to hear about it, I hope. And then I'm also talking about kind of the early highlights through 1934. And I said, this is just part of some research I've done. I've actually done some research in the State Archives of North Carolina, also through other accounts that covers the entire history of this school, and it goes up to 1970. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that yet, and I'm still weighing about if I'm going to publish this as a separate book or something else. I don't know, but there's a lot more that I could talk about it, and the history goes well beyond 1934. Okay, the reality is that if you look at what is now P.W. Moore Elementary, you will see that you will see a little bit of the building, a little bit of the school that existed before 1969. If you look at the gymnasium in the back, which is hard to see unless you drive around the back, that gymnasium was constructed during the years when it was a segregated junior senior high school. And that part of the building still exists, though most of the rest of the building was constructed after 1969. Question. Was this school, the one I'm talking about today, the one you're here to listen about, was this school the first to offer a high school education for Blacks in Northeastern North Carolina? You can shake your heads yes, shake your heads no. What do you think? Was this the first? Well, in some ways, in a tiny way, yes, but in a large part, no. It is true that this school was the first truly local Note that local is emphasized here on my PowerPoint, and public school that offered a high school education. There was a rich history of secondary education being available for Blacks long before 1923. In fact, for much of this period, actually there were more opportunities, which is probably unusual in many regards. There were in many ways more opportunities for Blacks than whites in Elizabeth City in many parts of the decades before 1923. One can go right back until the Freedmen's Bureau School that was opened in the late 1860s. Opened, and its most famous teacher, its most famous principal is a man named Thomas Cardozo. He later on became famous because he later moved to Mississippi and became a state official, a leading state official in that state. But when he was in Elizabeth City, this school offered mostly what we would call a primary education, though looking through the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, I discovered that the school had actually a higher department, and it was entitled a higher department, in which at least 5 students learned about higher subjects than that you would not hear about or learn about in elementary school, the classics, for example. So even though this was mostly a primary school, and the reality is that some of these students later on became highly successful. If you go right outside, if you go right down the street off Ehrenhaus and you turn right at Firehouse Subs and Dollar General, you will go to the next block and you will see a small graveyard across the street from Mount Lebanon AME Zion Church. Actually, 2 of those grave sites are actually from students who went to Cardozo School. One of them actually later on became a professor of Greek at Howard University, and arguably the first Black professor of the classics at Howard University. He's buried in this town, in that little off across the street small graveyard. He went to this school. He actually later on went to Amherst College and we became Phi Beta Kappa, which was extremely unusual, very rare. And he's not the only one. In 1877, a man named Rooks Turner established the private Elizabeth City High School. He later opened up actually additional schools in this region. At one point, he opened up and had running 3 schools. The building, because he actually owned the property, the building at which he had his school was the first home, the very first home during that first year of what was called the Elizabeth City State Colored Normal School, and now today we call Elizabeth City State University. Turner's school building was the home from that first year. And if you were here about 5 years ago or more, maybe more like 8 years ago, I did a presentation in which I discussed this and had some pictures of that school. But not only that, 1891, as I mentioned, Elizabeth City State Color Normal School opened up. Now, again, this school offered 4 years above the primary grades. The purpose of this school was to train teachers to teach in primary schools, in the public primary schools that serve Black students. Again, this was not a university in 1891. It was not even a high school. In fact, if you could basically describe it, it was more, if the definition of primary education was grades up to 4, then this offered 5, 6, 7, and 8. So, but this was secondary. And over time, they offered more and more. As a side note here, and this is sometimes has been forgotten for the large part, the history, but people sometimes forget that in the 1880s, there was actually a normal school in Elizabeth City for whites that existed. This was before 1891. And during this time, normal schools were not established with buildings. They were more or less year-to-year operations. In fact, the one Elizabeth City State Color Normal School, they didn't have its own property until the 1900s. Okay, they rented, the state paid Rooks Turner for that building. They rented that building. So in 1880s, there were, for about a 4 or 5 year period, summer times there was a normal school. And the goal was to teach white teachers to teach in the white schools. So there was actually a normal school back in the 1880s, and you can actually find the records, they've been digitized. The man named Samuel L. Sheep was one of the instructors during that summer session, these summer normal schools. And of course, we know Sheep Harney Elementary School. It did not have a permanent location, but it did exist. There's a side note here. Back to the black schools, 1896, the founding of Roanoke Collegiate Institute. It had both primary and high school levels. The high school level education included the sciences, languages, and higher math, more or less like a college prep. Many of the students who went to Roanoke Collegiate Institute later on went to Shaw. In many ways, this was a feeder school for Shaw, and many students went there and became ministers and many other things. But it was mostly a primary school that instilled Christian values. Okay. In 1900, this is kind of when you start seeing some changes. This is sometimes forgotten as well, because North Carolina, in terms of the South, we have a lot to be proud about in terms of our higher education. We are the only state in the South that has 5 public, historically Black institutions. Plus, we have other private ones like Livingstone and St. Aug's and many others. Back in 1900, North Carolina was not known for being an education state. In fact, when it came to literacy for whites, it was either the lowest or the second from the bottom in the nation. So in 1900, the General Assembly added, and this is a controversial issue, I've talked about it before, but this related to the white supremacy campaign. In 1900, the state of North Carolina, the Constitution was amended by referendum in the summer of 1900. And that meant that voters would have to prove literacy. White voters actually did not have to prove that until 1908 because they were grandfathered in. And the state started to invest more in training schools for whites in order so white students could become literate adults who could presumably pass literacy tests. The state, in other words, sort of around 1900, got involved more in education. They purchased or opened what schools that we now are familiar with. Western Carolina University, ECU started as a school, training school for whites. Appalachian State was purchased from somebody else. Now, this meant that you still list in high school education. 1900 is when you start seeing less interest and less investment in Black high school education and more in education for whites. Now, again, education is important for everybody, regardless gender, race, ethnicity. It's important. Everybody should be educated. A point out here is that it was not until 1907 that the first truly public high school, now this was high school for whites, was opened, April 1907, when Elizabeth City voted a special tax of 40 cents on every $100 in property value. They purchased Samuel L. Sheep's Atlantic Collegiate Institute, turned it into Elizabeth City High School. Okay, so the first high school for whites was 1907. Before then, if you were white, you either had to go to private schools like Atlantic Collegiate Institute or other private schools that existed. 1907, it opened up with 189 students and 6 teachers offering 16 subjects during a 180-day school year. Okay. Now that's important. And someone said, someone down the line, I think, should do a history of that school as well, because there are other schools like that. And it's important because education is important. But what's noteworthy is you start seeing the shifting of funding, you start seeing the shifting of interest. By the late 1910s, there were very few opportunities for Blacks to receive high school education. The closest was actually at Elizabeth City State Normal. And again, that school was organized and established to train teachers, not to produce high school graduates. The reality was, by the late 1910s, most Blacks, and in fact, for that matter, many or most whites as well, received no more than a primary education. In my house, in my bedroom, I have my grandfather's 1936 primary school graduation. He never went to high school. Okay, that was 1936. So the fact is that many did not go beyond primary education. The focus was on manual labor, agricultural labor. In 1919, the General Assembly thought that this had to stop and that we need to get students in schools, they need to learn, they should be working out in the farms. And so they passed the Compulsory Education Act, which mandated that students of a certain age group spend so many days in the classroom. Okay, before then, there really wasn't much of a law that made this firm, but many people opposed it. And that's actually what was the biggest problem among education was a lot of times the public did not support it. The public did not see illiteracy as a problem. The public did not want to pay taxes to invest in schools. For whites themselves, and especially for blacks, because black voters were pretty much purged from the rolls after the 1900 referendum. And this in checking out in W.O. Saunders' paper, The Independent, it was causing problems. Farmers wanted to keep their kids at home so they could work on the crops and plow the fields and harvest the crops. They didn't want to have them in school because I wasn't going to help them out. So there was a fight. High school education we take today for granted. Much more. In these days, it was more like a luxury. Now, how does this play into the founding of PW Moore, the actual founding of the school? Okay, now this is where it gets interesting here is the three men. Now, this is, you think, interesting here. The three men, and I'm just saying this because this is history here. The three men most instrumental in the founding of this first truly public high school in Elizabeth City for blacks were actually three white men. W.O. Saunders, the editor of The Independent, also at one point served a term in the General Assembly, also served as the chair of the Board of Trustees at State Normal School. A man named E.F. Aylett, who was famous as a lawyer who prosecuted the Nell Cropsey, actually defended the Nell Cropsey case. Very wealthy man who made a lot of money renting out subpar shacks, i.e., a slumlord, to poor people, mostly poor whites, poor blacks. This is a real questionable character. And Nathan Carter Newbold, who actually was he was actually a Pasquotank County native. He grew up on Body Road, and he later became the first state official. He became the director of Negro education at the state level. And so these all individuals came together, and this is, again, this is a very unusual. I know of no high school in North Carolina that was anything like this kind of founding. Okay, some background. 1920, federal inspector came to town and condemned the schools in this town for being overcrowded, unsanitary, and outright dangerous. And I could give you examples and specifics, but it would gross you out. And I know it's close to lunch, and I don't want to do that. This is called History for Lunch. And the federal report is actually out there on cyberspace. You can actually read about it, and the daily papers talked about it as well. And it's just disturbing. I mean, especially comes to the bathrooms. I mean, just horrendous. This was disgraceful. This was disgraceful. And both white schools and black schools had this kind of problem. So the city had to get its act together. 1922, in the summer, the plans for 3 new school buildings were set. One would be a high school building for whites. That was going to be Elizabeth City High School. It was going to replace the decrepit building that had been purchased when the city voters in 1907 voted a tax to support a high school for whites. One would be a gymnasium, an auditorium for whites, and the third would be a school building for black students. Okay, so the plans were to build a black school, 1922, built on Body Road. We call that part of Body Road now Roanoke Avenue, and heated by steam. And that was a big deal. It was actually going to be a heated building, and not heated by wood, but actually heated by boiler. By December 1923, the Elizabeth City State Normal School Board, the chair of the board was W.O. Saunders, newspaper editor and such, was tired of being exploited, because the way it worked here is that the city of Elizabeth City was so cheap. They didn't want to invest money in black students, so they would dump them off onto the state normal school and have the state taxpayers pay for them. And that's not why the school was founded. The school was founded to train teachers, not to serve as a depository for students that you don't want to basically pay taxes to teach. The board has said, okay, enough's enough. We've been doing this for years, and PW Moore supported because he cared about kids. But he said, this has got to stop because we can't afford to do this. It's hurting our mission. The board decided to stop furnishing a high school education free of cost. Okay, from now we have to start paying, because we have costs too. Now, E.F. Aylett was the chair of the Elizabeth City School Board. Again, he was wealthy, he was prominent. When he passed in 1930, his estate was estimated to be about $400,000, which would be like $10 million today. He made a lot of money off other people's suffering. Aylett didn't like being told that you have to pay for it. And he sent a letter to Nathan Carter Newbold, who was the director of Negro education. He basically pretty much didn't like being told this. I said, you're not making, that's not right. You're making us pay for these students now. Well, Newbold wrote back. Now, Newbold, he was a supporter of Black education. His whole career was, in his view, trying to narrow the gap between Black education and white education, so the costs would be treated equally and such. Newbold wrote back and told him the taxpayers in North Carolina furnished the money to build a Elizabeth City State Normal School to train Negro teachers for the Negro schools of the state, and not for the purpose of furnishing elementary or high school advantages to the Negro children for which the town of Elizabeth City is responsible. In other words, you need to start taking care of your own students. Not fair for the taxpayers to take care of it, but you won't do yourself. You see, in 1921, what we now call ECSU had begun now a 2-year collegiate program. And they couldn't be offering education for everybody else, but they would still do it. And until 1931, many students went there and got a high school education. There was a high school department until 1931, but they need to focus on training teachers, not teaching local students. Well, Newbold wrote back. He informed ALIT that the General Assembly already knows the truth, which is that the state of North Carolina has, through state normal school, provided schooling for half or more of the African-American children of the town since its founding in 1891. And until the last 3 or 4 years, the city got this completely free. The city had basically been getting this free for many years, and they're saying this has got to stop. Well, Newbold's letter angered ALIT. How dare this state official tell me, because I'm the chair of the school board. And ALIT wrote back and said, I suppose you have plenty of time with your good salary for your long letters. I have not. Well, ALIT thought, okay, I'm going to get this guy. I'm going to show him. I'm going to copy the letter to the state superintendent, as well as the members of the Elizabeth City Normal School Board of Trustees, also including Superintendent Samuel Sheep and P.W. Moore, the principal of the school, as if to show that, hey, you're going to know what kind of man, how dare this man talk to me like this? Well, Newbold wrote back and said, like the scuttlefish, you hope to muddy the water to divert attention from the facts and escape, but it cannot be. Newbold challenged ALIT to point out the errors in his letter and mockingly said that he expected a better command of the facts, considering that ALIT was a lawyer. Not only that, he took issue with ALIT's comments about his salary, saying, it will be consoling to you, it is to me, to know that you, nor any other taxpayer in North Carolina, contributes 1 penny to the good salary to which you refer. Think of the good money you were saving. And that's true, because Newbold's salary was not paid by the taxpayers, it was paid by the General Education Board, the GEB, that the Rockefeller family had founded. Because the fact is that state taxpayers didn't want to pay money to have a supervisor for Black schools because they were Black schools and they didn't care about Black schools. So without this foundation money, this philanthropic money, there would have been no one to supervise the schools in the first place. So Newbold's saying, you know what, I don't owe you anything. And he was right. He was right. Newbold concluded a little point more here, just a little bit more of a comeback, concluded by stating that ALIT forgot to send a copy of his previous letter to the chair of the state normal school board of trustees. And the reality is that Saunders and ALIT despise each other. We have record of them getting it in at least one fist fight, i.e. Saunders wrote in the Independent something that angered ALIT. ALIT came to Saunders' office and threatened to kick his, and sometimes did. And they would literally get in fistfights. So they despised. ALIT sued Saunders a number of times for slander. How dare you print this in the paper criticizing me? And then Newbold goes, well, Newbold saved the most comment for the last. I'm correcting your oversight in that respect by sending him a copy as well. Okay, so what this meant was that the city was going to have to take responsibility for teaching its own secondary and high school students immediately. So this school that was being built starting in 1922, maybe this is the school to do this. And the school, the new Black school on Body Road, we call it now Roanoke Avenue, opened in fall 1923, just in time for this new venture. And there is an early picture from the State Archives of North Carolina. I'm sorry, it's not the best here. But there it is. This is what the school looked like, 1923. Now, again, later on, they added some wings to it, and I'm not sure if maybe the wings were added at this point. This picture goes from about 1926. This picture was taken during the 150th anniversary of the United States. And this was, Newbold had this taken to show what North Carolina was doing in its black schools. And so there it is. There it is. Now, the principal of this new school, oh, by the way, it was not called a P.W. Moore at this point. It was simply just a black school on Body Road. The principal was actually a man named Lorenzo Stedman Burford. He was a Mississippi native, and he had a bachelor's degree from Wilberforce University. He actually had graduate credits at both Columbia and Hampton Institute. By the way, he was a principal, and he was the only high school teacher during the first year, because this is a brand new venture. And so the plan was to start small and then add more teachers. So he was principal and teacher, the only teacher. So I guess he supervised himself to that degree. He also taught science and citizenship. These are small beginnings, but more to come. Actually, the first name that I was able to find was actually called Elizabeth City Colored High. That was the name. But that name did not last for long. In late 1923, the school board meeting, it was determined that the school should be named and given a real proper name. And it was named after the poet, Paul Dunbar. And note that according to the school board records, this name haven't been selected by the colored patrons of the school. So in other words, black citizens petitioned the school board, say, we should name this school after Paul Dunbar to inspire our students to literary excellence. And so it was done. So this became now Paul Dunbar High School. And for this was now 1923-24. What happened during the first 10 years that's noteworthy? Because this school in time became the strongest, most excellent black high school in northeastern North Carolina. It was the best school academically. It was the best school in athletics. It was the prototype. Other schools, other districts sometimes sent their students to P.W. Moore and would pay the city for that privilege because the school became known as an outstanding example. It really was the crown jewel in high school education for Blacks in northeastern North Carolina. So what these first 10 years, what happened? October 1925, just 2 years into its existence, the state accredited the school as a Group 3 Class B standard 3-year high school. And notice here that today we think of high school as 9, 10, 11, 12 grades. There was not even a 12th grade until the 1940s. Basically was grade 7 was the end of that phase, and then you had 8, 9, 10, 11, and they finally added a 12th year in the 1940s. So by 1925, they are able to offer 3 years. Okay, and basically that would be 8, 9, 10. If somebody wanted to get another year, they would have to transfer and do their last year at State Normal School, which still had a high school department until the end of the 1930-31 school year. So interesting here. But the reality is that P.W. Moore, like other schools in the South, had to compete and survive on what we would call an unlevel playing field. And the reality was that during this time, there were 2 tiers. There was the white tier and the black tier of education. And they were not at all equal. They were separate, and they were, in fact, if I could, the first slide, maybe I should have made that, because they weren't equal inside. They weren't equal in terms of funding at all, but they were playing in an unlevel playing field. And that was true throughout the South. North Carolina was better than most. And I would say it wasn't always better up north either. Okay, it's not as if the north was some kind of just Shangri-La and the South was living hell. I mean, the north had problems too. Still does. I'm from the north, so I'm saying that, knowing that. The reality is that the school had overcome salary discrepancies. Okay, until around 1943. And the reason why this ended was because Nathan Carter Newbold fought to end it. North Carolina had 2 pay scales when it came to teacher salaries. There were 2 pay scales, and they were based strictly on race. They were, and I've seen the pay scales. I've taken pictures of the pay scales, and here is the white teacher scale, and here's the black teacher scale. It's like, you think, what about education? What about experience? Like, no, like to us today, that's like, what? Who cares? I mean, you're qualified, you're good, you're the best, you should be paid the same as any. Nope, there were two scales. Just an example here. During the 26-27 school year, principal of Burford was earning only $133 a month. And you see, that doesn't sound like anything. It doesn't sound a whole lot today. That was a pretty good salary back in 1926, 27, but nothing compared to the principal of Elizabeth City High School, who was earning more than twice that. Okay, now that's a discrepancy. And I don't know how to, I mean, there's no way to defend it in terms of, even if it's experience, because Burford was a young man, still that's a gross discrepancy. It's like, that's not even close, not even close. Just an example, another curriculum discrepancies. The schools were not able to offer the same subjects to students. So students who went to the Blacks High School got fewer subjects, opportunities to learn different things. 1927 meeting, it was agreed to hire a PE teacher for Elizabeth City High School for $2,000 for the year. By the way, that's more than the principal at Dunbar High School made, okay? There was no PE teacher at Dunbar School. Okay, so PE is very important. We talk about it's important to have students learn healthy habits and physical activity, and then there's no PE, but there's PE has one school and the other one doesn't have any PE at all. That's a discrepancy. Enrollment discrepancies. Another sad reality is that throughout this period is that many promising Black students often did not enter or really could not enter or finish high school, because the reality is the economic of the South was that many times they were needed more to work in farms, agricultural labor, manual labor for economic reasons. So the reality and the sad reality is that many times Black students did not continue on to high school. Sometimes their families would say that you can't do it because we need you here to work. In this region, many Blacks were farm laborers, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and they really needed, because especially talking about the 1920s and 30s, they needed all the work in order to survive. So that explains why, in many regards, is that despite having a Black high school, many Black students were not able to continue after primary education. Some didn't even make it that far. And again, these gaps over time decreased. They decreased, and they decreased for many reasons. Many reasons that go beyond what we're talking about today, that go to the civil rights movement. 1923 in North Carolina, there were only 8 public high schools for Blacks. That was a year that P.W. Moore, we call P.W. Moore opened up. It was Paul Dunbar by late that year. Only 8 in the entire state of North Carolina. And there was one of them here. There was one of them here. This school was one of only 8 public high schools for Blacks, and only 177 students actually were enrolled. By 1924, the number went from 8 to 14, almost doubled in a year. The 1920s was a major decade in terms of Black education. It was a major decade for Elizabeth City State Normal School. Many of the buildings from that campus were built during the 1920s. The state realized that what it had done was deprive people of an education, and they started to make changes starting in the 1920s. 1928-29, the school offered a fourth year for the first time, a 4th year of high school education, and became a fully accredited public high school for Blacks that offered all 4 years. That was a unique, and by far most counties did not have that. A fully accredited public high school for 4 years. By the way, the school still offered, this wasn't just simply a high school, they had education for lower grades as well. But they did offer high school, and high school was improving and it was increasing. But there was still, despite that, throughout the rest of the decade, the city was now paying and would continue to pay state normal school for some of its students. The fact is that there was not enough room for them in the new high school for them, so some still went to state normal school. And the city now paid them the money they deserved from the city taxpayers. State normal school graduated high school students to the end of the 30-31 school year. Okay, uh-oh, snooze, okay. Oops. Okay, sorry. It just had one of those screens pop up here about restarting. I'm thinking, no, don't restart now. Um, so something to note here is one of the teachers that became rather famous at this school was a woman named Mary B. Williams. And she taught at the school for nearly 30 years. She started teaching there in 1930 because her husband, Sidney Williams, got a job as academic dean at State Normal School. He later on became president, Sidney David Williams. And during this whole time, she taught at the high school. And I've heard from some students back from the 40s and 50s years ago, sometimes they remember him picking her up after school because he had one of those big cars from the 40s. Well, it was big boats. And they remember him driving by to pick her up after he left the campus. So she taught for nearly 30 years. Okay, 1931, there was a new change in leadership. 1931 in July, Ebby A. Anderson was elected a teacher. In August of that year, a month after Anderson was hired as a teacher, Principal Burford resigned. And that there was an opening, and within a month, they promoted him from being a new teacher to new principal over a summer. And he served for 25 years until 1956. He was the second of the 3 principals in the school's history. Later on, Anderson retired and was replaced by a history teacher named Calvin Page. Many of you might remember Calvin Page. He might have been principal when you were a student. But who was Anderson? Anderson was formerly principal of Hertford High, also in Plymouth. He had a degree from Benedict College in South Carolina. He was a World War I veteran. Like Principal Burford, he had taken classes at Columbia University. The reality was that graduate schools in the South would not admit Blacks until much later on. So if Blacks wanted to earn graduate school, they had to go up north. And many of them went to Columbia. I know Coach Vaughn on campus went to Columbia. Ebby Anderson married former Maddie Johnson, a graduate of State Normal School, and he served at Mount Lebanon A&E Zion Church. Now, what about Burford? He resigned and he ended up completing a master's degree. So I think he resigned to complete this degree. And his thesis, which came out about 1932, I think, was entitled The Social and Economic Status of Negro High School Students in Northeastern North Carolina. Still there in the Hampton University Library. He passed away in 1938, and I'm not sure why or how, or he was still a fairly young man. And he's buried in Oak Grove Cemetery. And I went there about a month and a half ago, and I found his gravestone, and it's on your screen here. But he, the first principal of what we would call P.W. Moore High School, buried in this town. 1930-31, major year of school history. Every student in the senior class graduated. That doesn't even happen in 2022. I hope it does, but I'm not sure it's going to. We'll find out in a few weeks, I think. Attendance had improved across the board. In 1923-24, it was only about 60 on an average day. Within only 7 years, it had gone up to 200. And 80% of the graduates were actually now attending State Normal School. They were attending higher education. 4 out of 5 attending higher education after completing a high school diploma. That's noteworthy, especially in 1931. 1931 in December, the school board received a petition signed by the city's leading Black citizens requesting that the name of Dunbar High School be changed to P.W. Moore High School. And obviously it was in honor of P.W. Moore, who 40 years earlier had become principal of a small school, State Normal School, with only one other teacher, and had changed that school and had transformed that school. And in honor of that man, and I'll say P.W. Moore to this day is the greatest educator to ever serve in Elizabeth City. I'm saying that, I don't see anybody coming close. The greatest educator in the history of Elizabeth City. The school was named after him. P.W. Moore offered different kinds of training. This wasn't just an academic education. He offered vocational training. 1934, it had its own farm where it grew food for the cafeteria. And many years earlier, the trustees of the city graded school, the Black graded school, gave the school the farmland for cultivation, and so they produce all things: spring beans, beets, corn, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, all the things that a good farm should produce. And so, and again, this would continue. The Peter B. Moore would offer not just an academic education, but would offer vocational training and agriculture, and over time, different other subjects would be added to that school. And that school, again, was an excellent school, an outstanding school. I said the crown jewel for Black high school education in Northeastern North Carolina. Okay, I'm done. Any questions? I answered all your questions in the presentation. Any questions?
I just had a question about
Yes.
the controversy that arose when Ava was
Yes.
back against the state.
Yes.
Is your sense that it was him as an individual, or do you think he represented the board as a whole? Do you think he had support, pretty broad support within the board, or do you think he was just kind of had his own issues?
From my reading of the accounts of his personality, and again, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, I think it was more individual. He was very wealthy. He owned a lot of, he was a slumlord. He made a lot of money off the suffering of the people, and he didn't want to pay taxes back to the people who were suffering under his slums. And I think it was mostly because he was worth a lot of money, and he wanted to keep his taxes low. And the way school taxes were funded back in that day, back in 1923, a lot of times they were funded by taxes, primarily taxes on property. He was a major property owner. It wasn't until the 1930s when Governor Ehrenhaus instituted the sales tax. And the sales tax, which started out like, I think like a penny or a penny and a half, is now six and a half. But that funds the schools a lot more. Back in those days, the property owners financed the schools more. So I think, to answer your question, I think personally, Alit just didn't want to give up. I mean, again, he had a successful law practice. He's someone who's very famous in this town for his role. He was very active in that way. But I think it's more, in my opinion, it was more individual. And he was seen, and of course, Saunders would always portray him as such, as he was this boss. He was the town boss, and nobody got anything past this guy. And I mean, he really was viewed in many ways by many people as he was in it for himself, and he made decisions in this town behind the scenes, and that's how things got done. And to have someone there question him, you can sense that in the letter, like, how dare you do this to me? And it's just like, yeah, that's what we're going to do. You're going to open up a school. You're going to basically do the right thing and start paying money for the students whom you are obligated to serve. So yeah. Other questions? Yes. Yes.
Still standing.
Not the Rooks Turner building was burned down, and I'm not. I think there was a major fire at Roanoke Institute in the mid 1930s, and I think I wrote an article in the Daily Advance about that fire. And that building was one of those buildings that was destroyed permanently, but that was only during the first year. But that Rooks Turner building, Rooks Turner sold that building to the Roanoke Missionary Baptists, and they established Roanoke Institute at that building. Well, after the fire, Roanoke Institute, the campus of Roanoke Institute back in the 1930s wasn't just one major building. It was a number of buildings. So, and instead, if you look at the newspaper records and the Daily Advance about the fire, and also the Independent, you will see that there wasn't just one building, but this was the major building. It was a huge building. I mean, it looked like in terms of a structure, it must look like it looked like a very large house with a wraparound porch. Like many you see around town here, there's some of the ones, but this was it was his property. And unfortunately, Rooks Turner fled Elizabeth City around 1897 because apparently from what we've been able to find out is he fled to up north for his life because he had been disrespected in a sidewalk confrontation. Apparently a fight between he and a white man, and the feeling was better get out of town before sunset or else he might not be around in the morning. So he moved to Baltimore, earned a master's degree at Howard, and later became a teacher. And he passed away 1920s. Very sad. It's a very sad story. But
Is there any monuments or any way that he was ever honored for his early education role?
other than the talks that I've given in this town, and other than the research that the late Leonard Ballou did in the before I came here, and other than the fact that his son Lorenzo Dow Turner became a prominent linguist, nationally known linguist, there was no physical, but no, his legacy is in the fact that he was able to make Elizabeth City unusual in that it had many opportunities for Blacks for education before 1900. But there's no physical, there's no marker. That would be fitting. That would be fitting. And another project right now that's actually coming into, it's good. That would be a good thing. Questions? Did I hear any other questions from anybody? Did that answer? Okay.
We have no questions in the chat, but we do have Yvonne Walton and Frankie Johnson of the P.W. Moore class of 1969.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you. Thank you. And yes.
You were, I see that she mentioned names of watching this, and they're graduates of P.W. Moore.
Yes.
Well, we're graduates of P.W. Moore.
I'm quite aware. I'm quite aware, man. Yes.
I'm proud of P.W. Moore.
You should be proud of P.W. Moore. You should be proud of P.W. Moore. You received a top-notch education considering what was going on, and you have every reason to be proud of that. And anybody who's a graduate of that school should be proud and should walk with a head held high, because this was a great school that served the students and produced great graduates, judges and others as well, prominent teachers, and yeah, I could go on the list here.
One of my classmates, he became an airline. It was first with United pilot out of all the people, and it's Hilliard Hines, Hilliard Braxton Hines from Newland. So and he retired from. In fact, he did fighter jet planes in the Vietnam War, and then finally, I think in his latter years, he did the UPS, those big planes.
Sure. Wow. I said the number of P.W. Moore graduates that I'm familiar with in this town, and Billy Reed, he was one too, right? And such, yeah. So, yeah. Yes.
I'm Sharon Lunston, and
yeah, hi.
I was one of those groups of students.
Yes, you were.
Who visited high school.
Yes, you were. I remember the name.
That's true. I went there, but I only stayed a week because I was out of my comfort zone. And
Sure.
the children over there treated me real nice,
Sure.
but I didn't feel comfortable. I wanted to be around my friends, so I went back to P.W. Moore. So I only stayed Mississippi High School
Yeah.
1 week. I went there to help integrate, but I went back not because they mistreated me,
No.
because I want to go back in my old element.
That was a brave thing to go over there in the first place. And you were here when I talked about, were you here when I talked about that back in January? Oh, you missed that.
I missed that one, but
I specifically talked about the students, and I named you by name. And I named you by name.
Somebody questioned you about, I didn't go there, but I did.
Your name came up in my research.
Yes, I went there, but I only came back to be in my own element, feeling, and I'm glad I went back.
Yeah.
Because we were like a family.
Yes.
And we were like brothers and sisters. We were very close, and we got a quality education, just like she said. And we all have done great things.
Well, the thing about it is education in those days. I mean, I think the word family, that definitely resonates from my research, is that the teachers truly loved their students. And sometimes that meant telling them what they needed to do and not letting them get away with what they shouldn't get away with. And you better not cross. I've heard about Mr. Witherspoon back in high school, Mary Anderson High School, and he would be spanking students on the monitors. People would hear, like, you better watch what you're doing, because and you actually would hear the whack, whack, whack. Don't. And they did it because, and again, we can have debate about corporal punishment, but the reality is that they want these students to grow up with morals and with character and with discipline and be productive citizens. And that's what it was about. And I think in many ways we've lost that. In some ways we've lost some of that. In some ways we've lost that. Some ways. Yes.
And one last thing, our teachers were not, and council would not let us sign up for courses that, we used to call them, I forget what the name, it was, you had to sign up with courses that you were capable of doing and challenged you. You could not sign up for courses that did not challenge you, just like because you wanted an easy day. They would not allow that. And our parents supported what the counselors and the teachers did for us. So that made a big difference as well.
And that's how you get better. I mean, when I was a student, I did the same thing in college. I took the honors classes. I was like, bring it on. I can take it. Go ahead. I'm not scared of you. Bring it on. And that's how you get good. Is you don't get good in life by avoiding challenges. You get better by confronting them.
Yeah, we call them stop courses. That's what we would say. That was just a slide.
Well,
anybody who signed up for it just to try to get an easy grade, they were pulled out of the class.
That's good.
And,
that's good.
Put them in one that was challenging them. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, you went to an outstanding high school, and you in many ways you were blessed, and I'm certain you feel that way.
Oh yeah.
Which is why you're here today. You know, a lot of pride in that school. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you for taking your lunch hour with me. Thank you, Ms. Meads, for helping this up. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you. Good luck to you at Chapel Hill in the fall, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.